There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the clothes of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the simple act of a friend saying goodbye. You don't recognize them as tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface of your world until much, much later, when you're looking back from the new landscape they've created. For me, that moment was framed by the doorway of my apartment, backlit by the jaundiced glow of the hallway light. Julian stood there, one hand on the doorknob, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to have settled deep into his bones. He had already said his goodbyes, the usual soft murmur of thanks, the promise to text tomorrow. It was a ritual we had perfected over the last few months, a delicate dance of departure that preserved the fragile ambiguity of what we were doing. But this time was different. He had turned the knob, the latch had clicked, but he hadn't pulled the door open. He just stood there, his back mostly to me, a silhouette of indecision. My own heart was a frantic, caged bird, beating against my ribs, a desperate percussion accompanying the silent scene. Every instinct I had honed over years of loving him from a safe distance screamed at me to say something, to close the space between us, to unravel the terrible, beautiful knot of tension that had been tightening for weeks. But I was a photographer by trade and by nature. My primary function was to observe, to capture, not to interfere. So I remained silent, my own form of paralysis. He finally turned his head, just enough to look at me over his shoulder. His face was a landscape of shadows and soft light, his expression unreadable in the dimness. "Good night, Leo," he said again, and the words were just words, simple and functional. They were a period at the end of a sentence. They were a lock turning in a door. But his eyes were doing something else entirely. They were not saying good night. They were a question, a plea, a long, silent sentence filled with a yearning so profound it felt like a physical weight in the air between us. He was just saying goodbye, a formality he had repeated a dozen times before. But his eyes, lost and deep and achingly vulnerable, were asking me to make him stay. And in the breathless quiet of my apartment, with the city breathing its endless, indifferent sigh outside my window, I had no idea how to answer. To do so would be to admit I had been reading his every glance, cataloging his every touch, translating the unspoken language that had developed between us on my lonely couch. To do nothing would be to let this moment, this fragile, shimmering possibility, dissolve back into the ordinary, perhaps forever. Julian and I had a history that was as comfortable and worn as the old leather armchair in the corner of my living room. We'd met in a general education literature class in our second year of college, a prerequisite we were both putting off. He was the golden boy, a forward on the university's soccer team with an easy smile and a constellation of friends that seemed to orbit him wherever he went. He was studying engineering, a world of logic and definite answers that seemed a universe away from my own path in the fine arts department. I was quiet, perpetually attached to a camera, more comfortable observing life through a viewfinder than participating in it directly. We were an unlikely pairing, two celestial bodies with entirely different gravitational pulls, yet we somehow fell into a shared orbit. It started with a conversation about an obscure French New Wave film the professor had mentioned in passing. To my surprise, Julian had not only heard of it, he'd seen it. We ended up skipping the post-class migration to the campus coffee shop and instead spent 2 hours perched on a concrete bench outside the lecture hall, dissecting the film's use of jump cuts and its melancholic, meandering plot. I found that beneath the surface of the popular athlete was a thoughtful, surprisingly sensitive person with a deep love for stories. He found, I suppose, someone who didn't see the soccer star, but just the man who loved movies. That conversation became the bedrock of our friendship. We started a weekly tradition, cramming onto my tiny dorm room couch to watch old films, a habit that persisted long after we graduated and moved into our own separate apartments in the same sprawling city. Our lives diverged professionally. He went into software consulting, a high-stress, high-travel job that had him bouncing between cities, while I carved out a niche for myself as a freelance photographer, shooting portraits and quiet cityscapes. Yet, our friendship remained a fixed point, an anchor. He was the one person I could be entirely silent with, the one person whose presence was a comfort rather than an obligation. Over the years, he'd had a series of girlfriends, bright, beautiful women who, from my distant perspective, never seemed to fully grasp the quiet, restless part of him that I saw during our movie nights. I was always polite, always friendly, playing the part of the supportive best friend, while some vital part of me quietly withered. Because somewhere in those early years, probably during one of those late-night conversations illuminated only by the flickering blue light of a television screen, I had fallen in love with him. It was a hopeless, secret kind of love, the kind you quarantine in a sealed room in the back of your heart. It was a love I never intended to act upon. Our friendship was too precious, a rare and delicate ecosystem that I feared would be utterly destroyed by the clumsy weight of a confession. He was, as far as I knew, completely straight, and my feelings were a complication, a variable in an equation that didn't have a place for them. So I packed them away. I learned to live with the quiet ache, the low hum of longing that was the constant background noise of my life. I became an expert at managing the delicate architecture of our relationship, building walls and boundaries that were invisible to him but were, for me, load-bearing structures. I perfected the art of the casual, friendly touch that conveyed affection without revealing the desperate electrical current that shot through me every time my hand brushed his. I dated other people, men who were kind and interesting, but my heart was always a locked room, the key long since misplaced in my devotion to a man who didn't even know he possessed it. I told myself it was enough. Having him in my life as a friend, this incredible, irreplaceable constant, had to be enough. For almost a decade it was. The shift began subtly, a change in the atmospheric pressure before a storm. It started about 6 months ago. Julian had been dating a woman named Sarah for nearly a year, his longest relationship by a significant margin. On the surface, they seemed perfect. She was a landscape architect, creative and grounded, and for the first time, I saw a future for him that seemed stable. I had prepared myself for the inevitable wedding invitation, for the transition from best friend to a more peripheral figure in his life. I had even, in my more masochistic moments, practiced the smile I would wear as his best man. But then, the cracks started to show. Not in dramatic fights, but in Julian's increasing exhaustion. He was working on a massive, career-defining project that had him flying out of state every other week. When he was home, he seemed distant, his usual bright energy dimmed to a low flicker. Our weekly movie nights became less frequent, replaced by tired phone calls where he would talk more about software bugs and client demands than about anything meaningful. Then, one Tuesday evening, he showed up at my door unannounced. It was late, past 11, and a cold rain was slicking the city streets into a mirror of neon lights. He looked wrecked. His hair was damp and unkempt, his clothes were rumpled, and the shadows under his eyes were deep, bruised-looking things. He wasn't carrying his usual laptop bag or the six-pack of craft beer he often brought. He just stood there, dripping on my welcome mat. "Sarah and I broke up," he said, the words flat and devoid of emotion. I stepped aside, pulling him into the warmth of my apartment without a word. I took his wet jacket and hung it on the hook by the door, the fabric cold and heavy in my hands. I expected tears, or anger, or a long, drawn-out story of the final fight. Instead, he just sank onto my couch, staring at the blank television screen as if it held the answers to some cosmic question. He didn't want to talk about it, he said. It wasn't one big thing, just a slow erosion. A death by 1,000 small misunderstandings and weeks spent apart. He said he felt more relieved than sad, and that the relief made him feel like a monster. I made him tea, the way I always did when he was sick or stressed, and we sat in a comfortable, familiar silence. He didn't cry. He just seemed hollowed out, as if some vital, structural component had been removed, leaving him fragile and precariously balanced. He stayed for hours, not speaking, just sharing the space, breathing the same quiet air. When he finally left, well after 2 in the morning, he gave me a quick, desperate hug at the door, a gesture more of need than of affection. He was clinging to me like a man overboard clings to a piece of driftwood. It was the first time I felt the foundation of our carefully constructed friendship begin to groan under a new and unfamiliar weight. That night was the catalyst. The breakup, combined with the immense pressure from his job, had left Julian untethered. He had always been a person who thrived on structure and forward momentum. The rigorous schedule of a college athlete, the clear progression of an engineering degree, the defined path of his career. Now, for the first time, he seemed adrift, caught in a current he couldn't control. My apartment, my quiet, predictable life, became his harbor. He started showing up more and more frequently, always late, always looking like he'd been run ragged by the world. He'd arrive with the excuse of wanting to watch a movie, but we rarely made it through one. He'd fall asleep halfway through, his body finally succumbing to the exhaustion he fought to keep at bay during the day. At first, he would jolt awake, apologizing, embarrassed. He'd gather his things and hurry out, leaving me with the lingering warmth of his presence on the couch and the fresh, aching vacancy of his absence. My living room, once a neutral territory, was becoming charged with a new kind of energy. It was becoming a space of vulnerability, a place where he allowed himself to be weak, and I was the silent warden of that vulnerability. I never questioned it. I simply adapted. I started keeping his favorite tea in the cupboard. I made sure there was a spare blanket folded over the back of the couch. My life, which had been a quiet, solitary river, began to change its course, bending around his needs. I was a tidal estuary, my rhythms dictated by the gravitational pull of his distress. I found myself turning down evening plans, just in case. I'd sit in my quiet apartment, editing photos, the silence punctuated by a low-grade anxiety, a constant state of listening for the sound of his familiar footsteps in the hallway, the soft knock on my door. I told myself it was what any good friend would do. I was providing a safe space for him to heal, to recalibrate. But deep down, in the quarantined room of my heart, the hopeless love I had locked away began to stir. It was a dangerous, foolish hope, a tiny green shoot pushing its way through the concrete of a decade of self-denial. I was terrified of it. I knew it could destroy everything. But every time he appeared at my door, looking lost and broken, my resolve to keep that love contained would crumble a little more. I was his port in a storm, and I was beginning to forget that ships are meant to sail away once the weather clears. The ritual began on a Thursday night about a month after his breakup. Julian had been in Chicago for 3 days, and his texts had been clipped and stressed. He arrived at my place straight from the airport, not even stopping at his own apartment first. He looked like a ghost, pale and translucent under my warm living room lights. He dropped his suitcase by the door and collapsed onto the couch, not even bothering to take off his shoes. He closed his eyes and let out a sigh that sounded less like relief and more like a final surrender. I was at my desk, trying to finish editing a set of portraits, the soft click of my mouse the only sound in the room. "Don't mind me," he mumbled into a cushion. "Just need 5 minutes of not thinking." Those 5 minutes stretched into an hour. I worked quietly, stealing glances at him. His breathing evened out, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He was completely vulnerable, his public-facing armor of competence and charm cast aside. He looked younger, softer. My heart did a slow, painful clench in my chest. This felt different. This wasn't just falling asleep during a movie. This was a deliberate act of seeking refuge. When I finally finished my work, I found him still fast asleep, one arm dangling off the edge of the couch, his face half buried in a pillow. I didn't have the heart to wake him. I gently lifted his feet onto the couch, took off his shoes, and covered him with the blanket I now kept there for this exact purpose. I turned off all the lights except for the small lamp on my desk and went back to my chair, not to work, but just to sit in the quiet darkness with him. The space between us was charged, a high-tension wire of unspoken things. I was acutely aware of every breath he took, of the faint, clean scent of his laundry detergent, of the way a stray lock of hair fell across his forehead. It was an intimacy that was both excruciating and exquisite. I was a starving man being allowed to sit at a feast, but forbidden to eat. This became our new normal. 2 or 3 nights a week, he would end his day not in his own empty, quiet apartment, but on my couch. The pretext of watching a movie was quickly abandoned. He would simply arrive, shed the weight of his day at my door, and gravitate toward the couch as if pulled by an invisible force. And I would let him. I would continue with my evening routine, editing photos, reading, sketching, my presence a quiet, steady anchor in the room. The silence between us was never awkward. It was a language in itself, a shared space built on years of understanding. But now, it was layered with something new, something fragile and undefined. Sometimes he would talk, his voice low and tired, about the frustrations of his job, the endless meetings, the feeling of being a highly paid cog in a machine he didn't care about. He never talked about Sarah, or about dating, or about loneliness. He only talked about being tired. But I knew that tired was a euphemism, a container for a host of other, more complicated feelings: loneliness, confusion, a sense of being adrift. Then, one night, the ritual shifted again. He was lying on the couch, and I was sitting on the floor, leaning against it, reading a book. The geography of my small living room had been remapped around him. He had been quiet for a long time, and I assumed he was asleep. Suddenly, I felt a tentative touch on my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with sleep. "Yeah." I managed, my own voice barely a croak. "Is it? Can I?" He trailed off, and I could feel the heat of his hand through my t-shirt, a small point of contact that seemed to burn with an impossible intensity. I waited, my entire being focused on that single point. After a long moment, he shifted, a rustle of fabric, and then his weight was against my back. He had curled himself around me, his front pressed against my back, his arm draped loosely over my side. His head rested on my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. My mind went completely, utterly blank. And then it flooded with a tidal wave of sensation and panic and a wild, terrifying hope. Every nerve ending in my body was screaming. I could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against my shoulder blades. I could feel the soft texture of his sweater against my skin. The room was silent except for the sound of our breathing, which seemed impossibly loud. I sat there, rigid as a statue, my book forgotten in my lap. I was terrified that if I moved, if I even breathed too deeply, the spell would break. This was a line we had never crossed. Hugs were one thing, brief, friendly, buffered by layers of clothing and social convention. This was something else entirely. This was a deliberate, sustained act of seeking physical comfort, an intimacy that had no place in the neat, platonic box where I had stored our friendship. My internal monologue was a frantic, chaotic debate. What did this mean? Was he still half asleep, acting on some subconscious impulse? Was he so starved for simple human contact that he had turned to me, the safest, most convenient option? Or was it possible, just barely possible, that this meant something more? That this was a silent admission of a feeling he couldn't yet put into words? I tried to be rational. I tried to be the careful observer, the analyst. This was Julian, my friend, who was hurting. He needed comfort. That was all. To assign it any other meaning was to project my own desperate fantasies onto him, a dangerous and selfish act. I forced my muscles to relax, to lean back into him just a fraction of an inch, a silent signal of acceptance. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever done. He responded with a soft sigh, a sound of contentment that vibrated through my entire body, and snuggled closer, his arm tightening almost imperceptibly around my waist. And so we stayed, for what felt like an eternity, two figures huddled together in the dim light of a Tuesday night, suspended in a beautiful, agonizing ambiguity. This became the new, unspoken addition to our ritual. It didn't happen every time, but it happened often enough to become a pattern. He would settle on the couch, and after a while, he would find his way to me, either as I sat on the floor or sometimes, even more terrifyingly, by pulling me down onto the couch to lie beside him. He would wrap himself around me, or pull me against his chest, and fall asleep. And I would lie there, awake in the darkness, my heart a frantic drum against his steady, sleeping rhythm, my mind a whirlwind of analysis and longing. I learned the specific weight of his head on my shoulder, the exact texture of his hair against my cheek. I learned that he sometimes mumbled in his sleep fragments of code and client names. I learned that his hands, even in repose, were strong and warm. I was living in a state of heightened sensory awareness, every moment with him a photograph being burned directly onto my memory. It was a sweet, secret torture. I was closer to him than I had ever been, physically enmeshed with the person I loved, but the emotional distance felt like a chasm. He never spoke of it. The next morning, or a few hours later when he would stir and leave, he would act as if nothing had happened. He would thank me for the couch, run a hand through his hair, and be gone, leaving me to piece together my composure and pretend that my world hadn't just been fundamentally reoriented around the shape of his body. I existed in a liminal space, a hallway between two rooms, one of friendship and one of something more, and I was terrified of trying either door for fear of being locked out of both. My photography began to change. I stopped shooting the sharp, clean lines of cityscapes and started focusing on more intimate subjects. The way light fell across a rumpled bedsheet, the texture of a worn book cover, the interplay of shadows in the corner of a room. I was trying to capture the feeling of our evenings, the quiet, heavy intimacy, the sense of waiting for something that might never arrive. My work became softer, more melancholic, more full of longing. I was documenting my own secret heart, translating my yearning into silver gelatin prints. The anxiety was a constant companion. Every time he reached for me, a part of me soared, and another part recoiled in fear. I was playing with a fire I knew could consume me. What would happen when he felt better? When the project at work ended? When the sharp edges of his heartbreak had been worn smooth? Would he simply stop needing me? Would he wake up one day, clear-eyed and restored, and be horrified by the intimacy we had shared? Would he pull away, embarrassed, and would our beautiful, easy friendship be replaced by a stilted awkwardness? The thought was a cold dread that lived permanently in the pit of my stomach. I was building my house on a fault line, and I knew it. But the comfort of his presence, the profound, addictive drug of his closeness, was too powerful to resist. I kept telling myself to enjoy it while it lasted, to be grateful for this temporary, borrowed intimacy. But hope is a stubborn, insidious thing, and with every night he spent curled against me on my couch, it grew, a wild and beautiful vine, threatening to choke the life out of my carefully tended pragmatism. I was caught in the current, and I no longer had any desire to swim for shore. I was simply letting it carry me, holding my breath, waiting to see where I would finally wash up. The night it all changed was a Wednesday in late autumn. The air had turned crisp, and the leaves outside my window were a blaze of gold and crimson. Julian had been gone for a full week, a long and brutal trip to the West Coast. The silence in my apartment had been deafening. I found myself unable to concentrate, my thoughts constantly drifting to him, wondering if he was okay, if he was eating, if he was sleeping. The dependence was mutual now, I realized with a jolt of panic. His absence had become a physical ache, a phantom limb. He texted me from the taxi on his way back from the airport. "On my way. Don't cook. I'm bringing pizza." Relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. He arrived looking more tired than I had ever seen him, but his eyes lit up when he saw me, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached all the way to his eyes. It was the first time I had seen that smile in months. We ate the pizza sitting on the floor, leaning against the couch, and he talked. He told me the project was finally, blessedly over. It had been a success. His bosses were thrilled. He had a mandatory 2-week leave. He was free. He seemed lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from his shoulders. A cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. The storm had passed. The ship was repaired. He wouldn't need my harbor anymore. I braced myself for the end of our ritual, for the return to our old, safer friendship. I tried to feel happy for him, but all I felt was a selfish, preemptive grief. After we ate, he stretched out on the couch, a familiar gesture, but this time he didn't immediately fall asleep. He stared up at my ceiling, his hands laced behind his head. The mood in the room was different. The desperate, weary tension of the past few months was gone, replaced by a quiet, contemplative energy. I sat in my usual spot on the floor, pretending to read, but my every sense was attuned to him. "You know," he said softly, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room, "I don't think I would have survived the last few months without this. Without you." My heart hammered against my ribs. "You would have been fine," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "You're tough." "No," he said, turning his head to look at me. His gaze was direct, intense. "No, I wouldn't have. I felt like I was unraveling. And coming here, it was like you were quietly holding all the threads together for me." I had no response to that. The honesty of it, the vulnerability, stole the air from my lungs. He was acknowledging the ritual, naming it, giving it weight. This wasn't just about a place to crash anymore. It was about me. He pushed himself up onto his elbows. "Come here," he said, his voice a low command. My mind screamed 1,000 warnings. "Don't. This is it. This is where you get hurt." But my body moved without my permission. I unfolded myself from the floor and sat on the edge of the couch, my back to him, my shoulders tensed. I waited for the familiar weight of his body against mine, the practiced, ambiguous comfort. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt his hand on my arm, gentle but firm, turning me to face him. He had sat up completely. We were sitting facing each other on the narrow couch, our knees almost touching. The space between us was electric, a live wire. The air was thick with everything we had never said. He was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was a mixture of uncertainty and fear and a startling, raw tenderness. It was the look of a man standing on the edge of a cliff, trying to decide if he wanted to fly or to fall. He lifted a hand, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before they gently brushed a strand of hair from my forehead. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a shockwave through my entire system. His eyes searched mine, and I felt completely exposed, as if he could see every secret I had ever kept, every hopeless fantasy I had ever entertained. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible thing, a vessel holding the weight of a decade of friendship and months of unspoken intimacy. I could see the frantic pulse beating in his throat. I was sure he could see mine. He was so close I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the faint scar above his eyebrow from a long-forgotten soccer injury. The entire world had shrunk to the space between our faces. He swallowed, a small, audible sound. "Leo," he whispered, and my name was a question, a prayer. And then he began to pull away. I saw it in his eyes first, a flicker of panic, a retreat. His hand dropped from my face. He started to shift his weight back, to create distance, to rebuild the walls. The moment was dissolving, the fragile connection breaking. And in that split second, I knew I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't go back to the safe, torturous silence. I had to know. "Don't," I said, the word barely a breath, but it stopped him cold. He froze, his eyes wide, locked on mine. He looked startled, as if he hadn't expected me to speak, to hold him there. And then the mask of panic fell away, replaced by a look of profound, heartbreaking relief. It was as if he had been waiting, hoping, for me to give him a reason not to run. He leaned in again, slowly, tentatively, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I was rooted to the spot, held captive by the raw honesty in his gaze. He stopped when our faces were only inches apart, his breath warm on my skin. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air between us, a perfect, fragile, crystalline thing. He wasn't assuming. He wasn't taking. He was asking. He was offering me the choice, laying his own vulnerability bare as a gift. And in that moment, all my fear, all my anxiety, all the carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart, they all just dissolved. All that was left was the simple, overwhelming truth. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. I simply closed the small distance between us. The first touch of our lips was impossibly soft, tentative, a question and an answer in one. It wasn't a kiss of passion or a frantic, pent-up desire. It was a kiss of recognition. It was a kiss that felt like coming home. It was quiet and gentle, and it tasted of salt and relief and the end of a very, very long wait. His hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek, and I leaned into his touch, my own hands finding their way to his waist, holding on as if to anchor myself in this new, unbelievable reality. We broke apart slowly, resting our foreheads together, our eyes closed, just breathing each other in. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was the most peaceful, profound silence I had ever known. We had crossed the line, and on the other side, we had not found destruction. We had found a quiet, new beginning. The aftermath was not the explosion of clarity I had anticipated. It was a slow, confusing fog. After the kiss, a second, and then a third, each one deeper and more certain than the last, we didn't talk. Words felt clumsy and inadequate. Instead, we just held each other on the couch, a tangle of limbs and quiet breathing, until the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the blinds. For the first time, he didn't just feel like a man I was in love with. He felt like mine. There was a rightness to it, a sense of a final puzzle piece clicking into place. I eventually drifted off, my head on his chest, his arms wrapped securely around me, feeling a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. When I woke up, the sun was streaming into the living room, and I was alone. The apartment was silent. The blanket was neatly folded on the arm of the couch. The pizza box was gone from the floor. The only evidence that he had been there at all was the faint indentation his head had left on the pillow next to me and the lingering scent of his cologne in the air. A cold, familiar dread began to seep into the edges of my newfound peace. I checked my phone. Nothing. No text. No missed call. It was as if the night before had been a dream, a vivid, heartbreaking hallucination. I tried to reason with the panic rising in my throat. He was probably just tired. He wanted to sleep in his own bed. He didn't want to wake me. There were 100 rational explanations, but none of them quieted the screaming voice in my head that said he was running. The silence stretched for a full day, and then another. I sent him a casual text. "Hey, hope you're enjoying the time off. You left your charger here." It was a lie. His charger was not here. It was a flimsy excuse, a desperate little flag waved in the vast, echoing silence. His reply came hours later. "Thanks, man. No worries. I have a spare. Talk soon. Man, talk soon." The words were so casual, so friendly, so utterly devastating. It was the language of our old friendship, a language he was using to build the walls back up, higher and stronger than before. The beautiful, fragile intimacy we had shared was being deliberately, systematically erased. The pain was a physical thing, a dull, heavy ache behind my sternum. I had allowed myself to hope, and the fall back to reality was brutal. I had misinterpreted everything. The kiss had been a mistake, a moment of post-stress confusion on his part, and now he was regretting it, trying to pretend it never happened. I had ruined our friendship. The one thing I had been terrified of for a decade, I had brought about in a single night of weakness. The next week was one of the longest of my life. I walked through my days in a haze of hurt and confusion. Every ping of my phone sent a jolt of false hope through me. I replayed the night over and over in my head, analyzing every word, every touch, searching for the moment I had gotten it so wrong. Had I been too forward? Had I misread his question? But he had asked, "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" He had initiated it. The memory was so clear, so real. How could I have imagined the tenderness in his eyes, the tremor in his voice? Was he that good of an actor? Or was he just that profoundly confused? The ambiguity was a special kind of torture. I felt like a ghost in my own life, haunting the spaces where he had been. The couch was no longer a comfort. It was a monument to my own foolishness. I avoided the living room, working from my small kitchen table instead, unable to look at the place where everything had changed and then had been cruelly unchanged. I felt a growing anger simmering beneath the hurt. It wasn't just that he was pulling away, it was the dishonesty of it. The silence was a betrayal far deeper than any rejection. After everything we had shared, after the months of him leaning on me, of me holding him together, I deserved more than a ghosting. I deserved the truth, no matter how painful. The quiet observer in me, the man who had spent years patiently waiting and watching, was finally done. The passivity had curdled into a need for confrontation. I couldn't live in this limbo, this purgatory of unspoken regret. I had to set fire to the fog, even if it meant burning the whole thing down. It was a Saturday afternoon, exactly 9 days after the kiss, when I finally broke. I couldn't take another minute of the suffocating silence. I put on my jacket, my hands trembling slightly, and walked the 12 blocks to his apartment building. I had no plan, no carefully rehearsed speech. I was operating on pure, raw nerve. I stood outside his door for a long time, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. What if he wasn't home? What if he was home, but he didn't answer? What if he answered and looked at me with pity? Taking a deep, shaky breath, I raised my hand and knocked. The wait was excruciating. I could hear faint music from inside. Finally, the lock clicked, and the door opened a few inches. Julian stood there, wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants. He looked surprised to see me, and tired. So tired. "Leo," he said, his voice flat. He didn't smile. He didn't open the door wider. "Can I come in?" I asked, my own voice sounding steadier than I felt. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting away from mine. Then he sighed, a sound of pure resignation, and stepped back, letting me into the sterile, impersonal space of his apartment. It was neat and tidy, but it lacked any sense of being lived in. It was a place to sleep, not a home. He didn't offer me a seat. He just stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. The silence stretched, awkward and heavy. "So," he said finally, "what's up?" The casualness of it, the blatant pretense, was like a slap in the face. The carefully controlled calm I had been clinging to shattered. "What's up?" I repeated, my voice tight with a week's worth of repressed pain and anger. "What's up, Julian? Is that 9 days ago you kissed me in my living room like you meant it? You held me all night. And then you disappeared. You vanished. And you've spent every day since pretending it didn't happen, sending me texts like we're casual acquaintances. So I guess my question is, what the hell is up with that?" The words came out in a torrent, harsher than I intended. I saw him flinch, his face paling. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at a spot on the floor somewhere to my left. He started, then stopped. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew meant he was stressed and overwhelmed. "I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" I pressed, my voice shaking now. "Sorry you kissed me? Or sorry you ran away?" "Because I need you to be specific, Julian. I can handle it if it was a mistake. I can. I'll be hurt, but I'll get over it. We can go back to being friends. But what I can't handle is this. This silence. This cowardly, insulting silence. After everything, I deserve better than this from you." A tear slid down his cheek. Then another. He still wouldn't look at me. He just stood there, crumbling in front of me, and my anger began to dissolve, replaced by a familiar, aching tenderness. "Just talk to me," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Please, just tell me what's going on in your head." He finally lifted his gaze to mine, and his eyes were filled with so much pain and confusion it knocked the breath out of me. "I don't know," he choked out, his voice thick. "Leo, I swear to God, I don't know." He sank down onto the edge of his pristine, unused sofa, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. The confrontation I had braced myself for, the anger I had been nursing, it all evaporated. All I saw was the man I loved, completely and utterly lost. I crossed the room and sat down next to him, not touching him, just closing the distance. "I'm scared," he mumbled into his hands. I don't. When I'm with you, in your apartment, it's the only time I feel like I can breathe. For months, it's been the only place I feel safe. And that night, it just felt right. It felt more right than anything with Sarah ever did. More right than anything ever has. And that terrified me." He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears. "What does that mean, Leo? I've spent my whole life on this one track. This one idea of who I am. Girlfriends, marriage, the whole thing. And then you. And it's like the entire map I've been using is wrong. I kissed you, and it was like I finally found north. But I have no idea how to navigate from here. I ran because I was scared of what it meant. And I was scared of hurting you. I thought if I just ignored it, it would go away, and we could go back to how things were." "And has it?" I asked softly. "Has it gone away?" He shook his head, a fresh wave of tears spilling from his eyes. "No," he whispered. "It's all I've thought about. Every minute. I've just been sitting in this apartment, wanting to be on your couch, wanting you, and hating myself for being too much of a coward to face it." His confession, so raw and broken, was not the neat resolution I had imagined, but it was something far more real. It was the truth. All the confusion, all the fear, all the messy, complicated feelings he couldn't name. He laid them all out before me. He hadn't been rejecting me. He had been struggling with himself. He hadn't run from me. He had run from a truth he wasn't ready to face. I finally understood. The unknowing initiator had finally come to know himself, and the revelation had shattered him. I reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold, but they curled around mine instantly, desperately. "You don't have to have a map, Julian," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "We can just figure it out. Together. You don't have to be scared alone." He looked at our joined hands, and then back at my face, a glimmer of something like hope dawning in his exhausted eyes. He didn't have to navigate from here. We would. The fog was finally beginning to clear. The conversation that followed our confrontation was not easy, but it was honest. We sat on his uncomfortable, stylish sofa for hours, the afternoon light fading to dusk outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, and we talked. For the first time, we talked about everything. He spoke of the suffocating pressure he'd felt his whole life to follow a pre-written script, the one that dictated a successful career, a pretty wife, a house in the suburbs. He admitted that his relationships had always felt like he was playing a part, one he had studied for but never truly understood. Being with me, he said, was the first time he felt like he wasn't acting. He confessed that the ritual of sleeping on my couch started as a simple need for escape, but it had slowly morphed into something else, a subconscious craving for a kind of intimacy and acceptance he'd never found anywhere else. He had been falling for me in slow motion, without any of the language or signposts to understand what was happening. The kiss wasn't a mistake. It was an inevitable conclusion he hadn't been prepared to reach. I listened, and for my part, I finally confessed the truth I had guarded for a decade. I told him about the quiet, hopeless love I had nurtured since college, about the walls I had built to protect our friendship, about the sweet agony of the last few months. I told him how I had been terrified of my own hope, convinced I was projecting my feelings onto his exhaustion and loneliness. As I spoke, I watched his face, and I saw not pity or shock, but a slow, dawning wonder. The pieces were clicking into place for him, the history of our friendship being recontextualized through this new lens. He wasn't just a man discovering his own unexpected feelings. He was discovering that those feelings were returned, and had been for a very long time. It was a revelation for both of us, a shared unburdening that left us feeling raw and exposed, but finally on solid ground. We were two people who had been speaking different languages about the same thing, and we had finally found a common tongue. When there was nothing left to say, a new kind of silence settled between us. It wasn't the heavy, anxious silence of the past week, nor the ambiguous, charged silence of the months before. It was a peaceful, settled quiet. It was the silence of understanding. "So," he said, his voice soft, a little shaky. "What happens now?" I looked at our hands, still clasped together between us. "Now," I said, giving his hand a gentle squeeze, "you come home with me. And this time, you don't have to sleep on the couch." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the first I'd seen in days. It was like watching the sun rise. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." We walked back to my apartment hand in hand, the cool night air a balm on our tired faces. The city felt different, brighter. My own neighborhood, so familiar, seemed new and full of promise. When we stepped into my apartment, it felt different, too. It was no longer a temporary harbor or a place of ambiguous ritual. It was simply home. That night, for the first time, Julian slept in my bed. There was no pretext of exhaustion, no unspoken negotiation of space. It was a deliberate choice, an intentional act of togetherness. As I lay there in the dark, his arm draped over my waist, his steady breathing a comforting presence beside me, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The frantic bird in my chest was finally still. The long, lonely vigil was over. There was no need to analyze, no need to interpret. The meaning was clear in the simple, solid weight of him next to me. The days and weeks that followed were a process of quiet discovery. We were learning a new rhythm, a new dance. The grand, dramatic moments were over. What replaced them was something far more precious, a tapestry woven from small, ordinary intimacies. It was in the way he started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom, a small, ceramic declaration of permanence. It was in the mornings spent making coffee together in my small kitchen, our bodies moving around each other in an easy, familiar choreography. It was in the evenings when he'd sit on the floor, leaning against my legs while I edited photos at my desk, his presence no longer a source of anxiety but a deep, grounding comfort. He was still the man who loved old movies, and I was still the man who loved to watch them with him. But now, when the credits rolled, I could turn and kiss him. I could pull him closer without fear. The love that had lived in a secret, quarantined room of my heart was finally allowed to breathe, to fill every corner of my life. He slowly started bringing his life into mine. A box of books appeared on my shelf. His favorite sweater found a permanent home on the back of my armchair. My apartment, once a solitary sanctuary, was transforming into a shared space, a testament to our merging lives. He was healing, not just from the stress and the breakup, but from a lifetime of misunderstanding himself. I saw the tension leave his shoulders, the weary lines around his eyes soften. The bright, easy smile I had first fallen in love with returned, and this time, It felt deeper, more authentic. He was discovering a version of himself he never knew existed, and I had the profound privilege of watching him bloom. One evening, a few months later, we were lying on the couch, the same couch that had been the stage for so much of our story. A movie was playing on the television, but neither of us was watching. I was sketching in a notebook, and he was reading, his head resting in my lap. It was a scene of such simple, profound domesticity that it made my heart ache with gratitude. He looked up from his book. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. "Miss what?" I said, pausing my pencil. "The drama," he said, a small, teasing smile on his lips. "The will they won't they tension. The agonizing ambiguity." I laughed, a real, unburdened laugh. I looked around my living room, at the soft light, at the comfortable clutter of two lives intertwined. I looked down at him, at the absolute trust and contentment in his eyes. The memory of the anxiety, the fear, the loneliness, it all felt like a story about someone else, a photograph from a distant past. "No," I said, leaning down to kiss him softly. "I don't miss it at all. There are moments that arrive disguised as something ordinary, and there are moments that are exactly what they seem, quiet, simple, and true. The journey to get here had been a slow, painful process, like developing a photograph in a darkroom, waiting patiently in the chemical bath for the image to emerge, terrified of letting in the light too soon. But now, the image was clear. It was fixed. It was a picture of two people in a small, warm apartment, building a life together in the beautiful, honest silence they had learned to create. We had found our way out of the fog, not by finding a map, but by agreeing to be lost together. And in doing so, we had found our way home.